The cruelest regret is realizing the person you pushed away was the only one who ever truly loved you. 5 years ago, Adrian Hale believed his life had finally become the quiet dream he had always hoped for. As an Omega who could not speak, Adrian had grown used to being overlooked by the world, but everything changed the day Victor Drake chose him. Victor was the powerful alpha who ruled Drake Holdings, a man whose name carried weight across the entire city. To everyone else he was cold, distant, and impossible to read, but with Adrian he had once been gentle in a way no one expected. Adrian still remembered the early mornings in their penthouse overlooking the skyline, when Victor would pour coffee into 2 mugs and quietly slide one toward him across the kitchen counter. Adrian could not say thank you out loud, so he would simply smile and write small notes on the pad he always carried with him. Victor used to keep those notes in his desk drawer as if they were something valuable. When Adrian discovered he was pregnant, he had been terrified and overjoyed at the same time. His hands had trembled as he wrote the words on a piece of paper and placed it in Victor's palm. For a moment Victor had simply stared at the message, and Adrian had braced himself for disappointment. Instead, Victor had pulled him into a rare embrace, resting a hand carefully over Adrian's stomach as if protecting something precious. For a short while, Adrian believed that happiness might finally stay. But happiness has a way of attracting shadows, and one of those shadows had a name, Marcus Lane. Marcus had once been part of Victor's past, a former lover who never truly accepted that Victor had chosen someone else. When Marcus returned to the city, he carried with him a quiet storm of resentment and carefully crafted lies. Adrian noticed the change in Victor slowly, the warmth fading from his eyes, the long silences growing heavier each night. Victor began coming home later, speaking less, watching Adrian with an expression that Adrian could not understand. One evening Victor placed a photograph on the table in front of him, an image that Adrian had never seen before, but that had clearly been manipulated to look like a betrayal. Adrian tried desperately to explain with hurried writing, his pen scratching across the paper while his hands shook, but Victor barely looked at the words. The doubt had already taken root. From that moment forward, something fragile between them began to break. Adrian carried their child with quiet determination, believing that once the baby arrived, Victor would finally see the truth. But rumors and whispers kept feeding Victor's suspicion until even the sound of Adrian's breathing seemed to irritate him. By the time Adrian reached his 7th month of pregnancy, the tension inside their once peaceful home had become unbearable. The man who once protected him now looked at him as if he were a stranger. Adrian still loved Victor then, perhaps more than he should have, and every night he pressed a hand to his stomach and silently promised the child growing inside him that everything would be okay. He did not yet know that the life he believed in was already beginning to fall apart. Marcus Lane did not storm back into Victor Drake's life. He returned quietly, carefully, like a shadow slipping through an open door. At first Adrian only noticed small things that felt slightly wrong. Victor began receiving late-night messages he refused to explain. Conversations would stop the moment Adrian entered the room. Sometimes Victor stared at his phone with a tight expression before locking the screen and slipping it into his pocket as if it contained something dangerous. Adrian tried to ignore the growing unease in his chest. Instead, he focused on the small life growing inside him. Every morning, he placed his hand gently over his stomach, silently greeting the baby who had already become the center of his world. He imagined a future where the 3 of them would sit together at breakfast, while sunlight poured through the tall windows of their penthouse. But Marcus was patient, and patience made his lies far more convincing. One afternoon Victor returned home earlier than usual. His footsteps across the marble floor were sharp and controlled, the way they became when he was angry. Adrian looked up from the couch, where he had been sketching designs for the nursery. Victor placed a thin envelope on the coffee table without saying a word. Adrian opened it slowly and felt his heartbeat begin to race. Inside were printed photographs and screenshots of messages that made it appear as if Adrian had been secretly meeting someone else. Adrian stared at the pages in disbelief, shaking his head immediately as tears filled his eyes. His pen moved quickly across his notebook as he wrote that the images were not real, that someone must have altered them, that he had never betrayed Victor. Victor read the words with a face that revealed nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Days passed, but the doubt did not disappear. Instead, it grew like a crack spreading through glass. Marcus appeared more frequently in Victor's conversations, always presented as a concerned voice who simply wanted to protect Victor from being deceived. Adrian began to feel as though he was living inside a house, where every wall slowly shifted against him. The man who once watched him with quiet affection now observed him with cold distance. When Adrian tried to show Victor ultrasound photos from the latest doctor visit, Victor barely glanced at them before setting the images aside. That small moment hurt more than Adrian expected. He had imagined Victor smiling, maybe even placing a hand over the picture the way he once had over Adrian's stomach. Instead, Victor simply walked toward the window and stared out at the city lights below. Adrian stood behind him holding the ultrasound photo for several seconds before lowering his hand. That night Adrian could not sleep. The baby moved softly beneath his ribs, reminding him that he was not alone even though the room felt painfully empty. He wrote a short note and left it beside Victor's coffee cup the next morning. It said only one sentence: "I would never betray you." Victor read the message in silence before folding the paper and placing it on the counter. For a moment Adrian thought Victor might say something. But Victor simply walked past him without speaking, and Adrian felt a quiet fear settle deep in his chest, the kind of fear that tells a person something precious is already beginning to slip away. By the time Adrian reached the 7th month of his pregnancy, the silence inside the Drake penthouse had become unbearable. The home that once felt warm and safe now felt like a place where every step had to be measured. Victor spoke only when necessary, and even then his words were brief and distant. Adrian moved through each day carefully, trying not to provoke the cold tension that seemed to follow Victor everywhere. His doctor had warned him that stress was not good for the baby, but avoiding stress inside that apartment had become almost impossible. Adrian spent most afternoons alone in the nursery he had quietly prepared. The small room had soft pale walls, a white crib, and a rocking chair placed beside the window where sunlight poured in during the late afternoon. Sometimes Adrian would sit there with his notebook resting on his knee, writing little letters to the baby about the future he hoped they would have. He wrote about walks in the park, about bedtime stories, about the way he imagined Victor might one day teach their child how to ride a bicycle. Even after everything that had happened, a part of Adrian still believed Victor would eventually remember the love they once shared. But that fragile hope shattered one evening when Victor finally confronted him. The storm outside the city had been building all afternoon, heavy clouds rolling over the skyline until the entire penthouse seemed dim and gray. Adrian had been sitting on the couch, gently holding his stomach as the baby shifted inside him, when Victor entered the living room with a rigid expression Adrian had never seen before. Without greeting him, Victor placed another folder on the coffee table. Adrian's chest tightened immediately. His hands trembled as he opened the folder and saw more fabricated messages. More carefully arranged proof meant to make it appear that he had betrayed Victor. Adrian shook his head desperately and began writing as quickly as he could, explaining that the evidence was false, that someone was manipulating the situation, that he loved Victor and would never do something like that. Victor watched him in silence before finally speaking. His voice was calm, but the calmness carried something colder than anger. Victor asked a question that Adrian felt echo through his entire body. He asked whether the child Adrian was carrying truly belonged to him. The words hung in the air like something heavy and impossible to escape. Adrian froze, staring at Victor with wide eyes as the meaning of the question slowly sank in. The notebook slipped slightly in his trembling hands. Adrian began writing again, faster this time, tears blurring his vision as he tried to explain that the baby was Victor's child, that it had always been Victor's child, that there had never been anyone else. But Victor no longer seemed interested in reading the words. He turned away and walked toward the window, his back stiff as he looked out over the dark city. Adrian felt the room begin to spin as the weight of the accusation crushed the fragile strength he had been holding together for months. The pain in his chest became sharp and overwhelming, and the stress that had been building day after day finally became too much for his body to bear. Later that night, Adrian was rushed to the hospital after severe complications began unexpectedly. The bright hospital lights and the quiet urgency of the medical staff blurred together in Adrian's memory. When he finally opened his eyes again hours later, the doctor stood beside his bed with a gentle expression that told Adrian everything before a single word was spoken. The baby he had been protecting for 7 months was gone, and the silence inside the hospital room felt even colder than the silence he had left behind at home. When Adrian woke again, the hospital room felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that settles after something important has disappeared. The soft beeping of medical equipment filled the background, steady and indifferent, as if the world had already moved forward without him. For a long moment Adrian simply stared at the ceiling, his hands slowly moving to rest over his stomach out of habit. The empty stillness beneath his palm made his chest tighten. Tears slipped silently down the sides of his face, soaking into the hospital pillow while memories of the nursery, the tiny crib, and the hopeful letters he had written to his unborn child flooded his mind. A gentle knock sounded at the door before a nurse stepped inside, with a sympathetic expression. She checked the monitors, spoke in a calm voice about rest and recovery, and told Adrian that the doctor would return soon. Adrian nodded weakly even though he could not bring himself to look directly at her. All he could think about was the child he had promised to protect. Hours passed before the door opened again. Adrian lifted his eyes slowly, and for a brief moment a fragile hope flickered in his chest. Victor stood in the doorway. His dark coat was still perfectly pressed, his posture straight and controlled, as if he had stepped out of a boardroom instead of entering a hospital room where his husband had just lost their child. Adrian's fingers tightened around the blanket. He searched Victor's face for some sign of concern, some trace of the man who once held him gently in the early mornings. But Victor's expression remained distant and unreadable. Victor walked toward the bed and placed a thin document folder on the small table beside Adrian. The movement was precise and businesslike, the same way he handled contracts at the office. Adrian's breathing grew shallow as he stared at the folder without opening it. A terrible understanding crept into his mind even before he touched the papers. With trembling hands, he slowly lifted the top page. The words were clear and unmistakable. Divorce agreement. For several seconds Adrian could not move. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the meaning of the document settled heavily over him. He looked up at Victor, confusion and disbelief filling his eyes. Adrian grabbed his notebook from the bedside table and began writing with shaking hands, asking why Victor would bring this now, asking whether Victor knew what had just happened, asking if their marriage meant so little that it could end in a hospital room like this. Victor glanced briefly at the written questions before looking away toward the window. His voice remained calm when he finally spoke, but the calmness carried an edge that cut deeper than anger. Victor said that he could not continue a marriage built on lies and uncertainty. He said that everything had already been decided. Adrian stared at him, the pen slipping from his fingers as tears blurred his vision. The loss of the baby had already broken something inside him, but hearing those words felt like the final piece of his world collapsing. Victor did not stay long. He simply told Adrian to review the documents and have them signed when he was ready. Then he turned and walked out of the room without looking back. The door closed quietly behind him, leaving Adrian alone with the papers resting on the small hospital table. Adrian slowly reached for the folder again, his hands trembling as he realized that in a single day he had lost both his child and the person he once believed would always stand beside him. 5 years passed, and the city that once held Adrian Hale's memories no longer knew that name. The man who quietly walked through the tree-lined streets of Brookhaven now was known as Elliot Nightfall. The name appeared on medical forms, school registrations, and the small brass mailbox outside a warm 2-story home at the end of a quiet suburban street. Life here moved at a gentler rhythm than the towering glass world Adrian once lived in. Instead of corporate meetings and distant city lights, Elliot's mornings began with sunlight filtering through kitchen windows and the cheerful noise of children waking up far too early. On most mornings, Elliot stood by the stove making pancakes, while 5 small voices filled the house with laughter. The scent of maple syrup and warm batter drifted through the hallway, while tiny footsteps raced across the hardwood floors. Elliot could not call out to them, but he did not need to. The children knew his gestures, the soft smile he used to guide them to the table, the way he tapped twice on the counter when breakfast was ready. Across the kitchen, another figure often stood pouring coffee into 2 mugs. Dr. Leon Nightfall was respected throughout the city hospital where he worked long hours as a trauma physician. Yet inside this home, he moved with calm patience that seemed to quiet every storm Elliot had once carried inside him. Leon had met Adrian during the darkest months after the divorce, when grief and loneliness had nearly erased the quiet strength Elliot once possessed. Instead of asking questions, Leon simply stayed, offering kindness in steady, practical ways. He brought warm meals when Elliot forgot to eat, sat beside him during silent evenings, and spoke to him as if the past did not define his worth. Over time, that kindness slowly built something new, something stable and gentle. The 5 children who now filled the house had arrived through different paths that life had placed before them, yet Leon loved each of them with unwavering devotion. The oldest boy, Noah, and beside him sat Emma and Lily, twin girls who shared a habit of whispering secret plans across the breakfast table. The youngest two, Oliver and Grace, often competed to see who could climb into Elliot's arms first whenever he returned from the grocery store. To the outside world, the Nightfall family simply looked like a peaceful household built on warmth and quiet happiness. In many ways, that was exactly what it had become. Elliot spent his afternoons helping the children with school projects or tending the small vegetable garden behind the house, while Leon returned home each evening just after 6 o'clock. Sometimes they would sit together on the back porch watching the sunset stretch across the sky while the children played in the yard. In those moments, Elliot allowed himself to believe that the painful chapters of his past had finally closed. The name Adrian Hale existed only in distant memories now, buried somewhere far away from this quiet home where laughter and gentle footsteps filled the halls. And yet in another part of the city, a man named Victor Drake was about to discover that the truth he had once refused to see had never disappeared at all. Across the city, the headquarters of Drake Holdings still stood like a monument of glass and steel above the skyline. But inside the top-floor office, Victor Drake felt a quiet emptiness that had slowly grown over the past 5 years. Success had never left him. The company continued to expand, investors trusted his decisions, and his name still carried influence in every major boardroom. Yet the penthouse that once overlooked the city now felt colder than it ever had before. Victor rarely stayed there anymore, often working late into the night inside his office instead of returning to rooms filled with silence. On one gray afternoon, a message arrived from the company's legal department regarding a financial investigation connected to several business dealings from years earlier. Victor almost ignored the report until one familiar name appeared within the documents. Marcus Lane. Victor's expression tightened as he opened the file. Page after page revealed details that Marcus had hidden for years. Altered photographs, manipulated messages, private investigators hired to fabricate evidence that would damage Adrian's reputation. Victor read the report slowly, each line pressing heavier against his chest. At first he refused to believe it. Marcus had once stood in front of him claiming he only wanted to help reveal the truth about Adrian's supposed betrayal. Victor had trusted those words without question. Now the investigation made it painfully clear that everything Marcus presented had been carefully staged. The evidence that destroyed Victor's marriage had been nothing more than lies arranged with cold precision. Victor leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline through the floor to ceiling windows while the weight of realization settled around him. Memories he had ignored for years began returning with unsettling clarity. Adrian standing quietly beside the kitchen counter with a notebook in his hands. Adrian writing frantic explanations while tears blurred the ink across the page. Adrian lying in a hospital bed while Victor placed divorce papers on the table without hesitation. Victor closed his eyes, remembering the way Adrian had looked at him that day. Not with anger, but with confusion and quiet heartbreak. The report confirmed that Marcus had already fled the country after the investigation began, leaving behind a trail of deception that finally exposed the truth Victor had refused to see. Victor remained motionless for several minutes, the silence of the office pressing against him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Adrian had been telling the truth all along. The thought struck him harder than any financial loss ever could. If Adrian had never betrayed him, then every decision Victor made 5 years earlier had been built on a lie. Victor reached for the edge of his desk as a dull ache spread through his chest. The realization brought with it a question he had never dared to ask before. Where was Adrian now? The last official record showed that Adrian Hale had disappeared shortly after the divorce was finalized. Victor had never attempted to find him. At the time, he believed Adrian simply wanted to escape the consequences of his actions. Now Victor understood that Adrian might have been escaping something else entirely. Regret settled into Victor's thoughts like a slow rising tide. Somewhere in the city, the man he once loved had built a life far away from the mistakes Victor could no longer undo. Victor Drake had spent years building an empire where every detail was controlled and predictable, yet the search for Adrian Hale quickly became the one thing he could not manage with a simple command. The records ended abruptly 5 years earlier, as if Adrian had simply stepped out of the world Victor once knew. Private investigators searched through old apartment leases, medical registrations, and travel logs, but every trail faded into silence. For weeks, Victor returned to the office each evening with the same hollow frustration pressing against his chest. Then one afternoon, a report arrived that finally broke the stillness. The investigator had located a man named Elliot Nightfall living in a quiet residential district on the western side of the city. At first, the name meant nothing to Victor, but the attached photograph made his breath stop. The man standing beside a small house, holding a grocery bag while a group of children crowded around him, was unmistakably Adrian. The hair was slightly longer now and the expression calmer, but Victor recognized the gentle eyes immediately. Victor stared at the photograph for several long seconds before standing from his desk. The quiet street where the Nightfall family lived looked nothing like the towering city blocks Victor was used to. Trees lined the sidewalks, bicycles leaned against fences, and warm lights spilled from the windows of neighboring homes as evening settled across the neighborhood. Victor parked his car at the end of the street and stepped out slowly, feeling an unfamiliar hesitation tighten in his chest. For 5 years he had imagined Adrian gone forever, yet now the man he once loved was only a few houses away. As Victor walked closer, he heard the faint sound of laughter drifting from a nearby yard. He stopped beside a wooden fence and looked through the open gate. The sight before him felt almost unreal. Adrian stood in the backyard wearing a simple sweater and holding a small watering can while several children ran across the grass chasing a bright red ball. The peaceful scene looked so ordinary that Victor felt momentarily frozen where he stood. One boy ran past Adrian, and Victor felt his breath catch. Another child followed, then another, until Victor counted 5 children moving across the yard. 5. The number repeated in his mind as the quiet truth slowly settled into place. The oldest boy laughed and called out to Adrian before running toward the porch where a tall man stepped outside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The man handed 1 cup to Adrian before resting a casual hand against his shoulder. Adrian looked up at him with a soft expression Victor had not seen in years. Victor recognized the man from hospital news articles he had once skimmed past without interest. Dr. Leon Nightfall. Victor remained behind the fence, unable to move as the realization pressed heavily against his chest. The children circled Adrian and Leon with the easy familiarity of a family that had grown together through countless quiet moments. Watching them felt like looking into a life Victor had never even known existed. And as the oldest boy glanced toward the gate for a brief second, those familiar gray eyes met Victor's gaze across the yard, leaving Victor standing there with a truth that was far more devastating than anything he had imagined. The quiet evening in the Nightfall backyard slowly continued as if nothing unusual had happened, but Victor Drake remained standing beside the wooden gate, with a storm of realization pressing heavily against his chest. The children eventually ran toward the porch where Leon Nightfall had placed a small plate of cookies on the outdoor table. Their laughter carried through the air with the easy warmth of a family that felt safe together. Adrian stood near the garden path, brushing a few strands of hair away from his face while watching the children with gentle patience. For a moment Victor could not move. The peaceful life unfolding in front of him felt like something he had no right to step into. But the truth he had discovered would not let him walk away. Victor slowly opened the gate and stepped inside the yard. The soft sound of the latch clicking drew Adrian's attention first. Adrian turned toward the entrance, and the moment his eyes met Victor's, the watering can slipped slightly in his hands. A quiet stillness fell across the yard. The children paused their game, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, while Leon instinctively moved a step closer to Adrian's side. Victor stopped several feet away, unsure for the first time in many years how to begin speaking. The confident alpha who once commanded boardrooms now felt strangely uncertain, standing on a small patch of grass. Adrian's expression remained calm, but his eyes carried a distant caution that Victor had never seen before. Victor finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual as he said Adrian's name. The sound of it seemed unfamiliar after so many years. Adrian did not respond out loud. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out the small notebook he had carried for most of his life. His pen moved slowly across the page before he turned the notebook toward Victor. The message was simple. My name is Elliot Nightfall now. The word struck Victor harder than any accusation could have. Victor took a slow breath before explaining everything he had learned about Marcus Lane, the lies that had been uncovered, and the investigation that proved Adrian had never betrayed him. His voice carried a raw regret that he had never allowed anyone to hear before. Victor said that he had made the greatest mistake of his life, and that he had come to ask Adrian to return with him so they could rebuild what had been destroyed. The yard remained silent for several seconds after he finished speaking. Adrian looked down at the notebook again, writing carefully before lifting the page once more. I already rebuilt my life. Victor followed Adrian's gaze toward the porch where the 5 children sat talking excitedly while Leon handed them glasses of milk. Leon then walked down the steps and gently rested his hand against Adrian's shoulder. The gesture was simple but filled with quiet meaning. Adrian wrote one final message and turned the notebook toward Victor again. When I lost everything, Leon stayed. The sentence hung in the air with calm finality. Victor felt the weight of it settle deeply into his chest. Standing there in the fading evening light, he finally understood that the family he had once thrown away had grown into something he could never take back. Victor Drake did not argue after reading the final message Adrian wrote in the notebook. The quiet certainty in those few words made it clear that the life standing in front of him was no longer something he could reclaim. For a moment, Victor simply stood there in the fading evening light, listening to the soft sounds of the nightfall home. The children had returned to their game near the porch, their laughter rising into the calm air, while Leon spoke to them with easy warmth. Adrian stood beside Leon with a peaceful expression that Victor had not seen in many years. It was not the fragile smile Adrian once carried during their marriage. This calmness came from something stronger, something built slowly through time and trust. Victor realized that the person standing in front of him was no longer the quiet Omega who once waited for his approval inside a cold city penthouse. Adrian had become someone who belonged fully to the life he had built here. Victor lowered his gaze for a moment before speaking again. His voice carried none of the authority that once defined him. He apologized, not with the polished confidence of a business leader, but with the quiet honesty of someone who finally understood the cost of his choices. Adrian listened without interruption. When Victor finished, Adrian did not write another response immediately. Instead, he looked toward the children, watching as the youngest girl ran across the yard and wrapped her arms around Leon's leg. Leon laughed softly and lifted her into his arms, spinning her once before setting her back on the grass. Adrian's eyes softened at the sight. After a moment, Adrian wrote one last message in his notebook and showed it to Victor. I hope you find peace too. The words were gentle but final. Victor nodded slowly as he read them. There was nothing else to say. The past could not be rewritten, and the family standing in that quiet yard had grown without him. Victor stepped back toward the gate, pausing only once to glance at the 5 children playing beneath the golden light of the setting sun. Victor opened the gate and walked back toward the street, leaving the warm glow of the nightfall home behind him. Months later, the city still spoke of Victor Drake as one of the most powerful men in business. His company continued to expand, his influence remained unquestioned, and the world saw only the success he carried with quiet control. But sometimes late at night, Victor would stand alone by the tall windows of his office, watching the distant lights across the city and remembering the small house on the quiet street where laughter filled the yard. Somewhere in that peaceful neighborhood, Adrian Nightfall lived a life surrounded by love, raising 5 children with the man who had stayed when everything else had fallen apart. And Victor finally understood that the greatest loss of his life had not been the divorce papers he once placed on a hospital table. It had been the moment he chose not to believe the person who loved him the most.